Now, if you mark in your Bibles, underline that.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the If You Mark in Your Bible podcast. My name is Josh, your host, and today we're looking at Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, and we've entitled this episode, The Most Frightening Excerpt. Our guest today and studying with us is no stranger to the podcast, BJ Clarke. BJ, how you doing?
Hey, good. Good to be with you.
Excellent. I appreciate you coming on, and before we begin, I'd like to ask you, if you were choosing a passage that you would consider the most frightening, what passage would you have chosen?
Well, honestly, when you gave me a list of possible verses to request for this episode, the one reason I chose this one, because it was available, is because one of the greatest apprehensions any religious person could ever have is to have devoted their life to a cause that turns out to not be the right cause, and to have the Lord say to you on the day of judgment, I never knew you, when you thought you knew him.
Excellent point.
So I can't really think of anything that would top this, at least for me. There are some others that would equal it when it comes to what the consequence of being sent away into everlasting punishment. Those are definitely verses that get your attention, but this one is right up there at the top of my list.
Excellent. And for those listening, be sure to let us know what you would consider the most frightening. Real quick, a brief context. We're at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus gives the golden rule. He talks about, false teachers and how you'll know them based on the fruits, and then closes out with the wise man and the foolish man parable. But in the midst of this is this account in verses 21 through 23, and entrance into the kingdom. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and bring up the text. I'd like to remind everyone that the text is powered by the Scattered Abroad Network, where you can catch this podcast and many others like it, along with a slew of resources as well. Also would encourage you to go wherever you download your apps and download the Scattered Abroad app. It's a resource that is well worth it and very beneficial in your personal study. So without further ado, we'll begin reading verse 21. It says, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. What do you have there?
Well, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that not everyone that believes he's the Lord or says that they believe he's the Lord is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think about the context of this whole sermon. It starts with kingdom living.
Right.
Who's in the kingdom, who's not in the kingdom. He gives a lot of contrast throughout, light versus darkness, narrow way versus broad way, and now it's obedience versus disobedience, because it tells me that someone could call him Lord and not enter the kingdom of heaven, and that makes me think, okay, I believe he's the Lord. Am I going to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven? So not only does this first statement make me know that just calling him Lord won't necessarily get me into the kingdom of heaven, it makes me kind of yearn for more. Okay, well, what would I be needing to know in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, besides the fact that he's Lord?
That's an excellent point. In fact, one commentator I read said at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount is this entrance into the kingdom. Like you mentioned, the kingdom is the focus and how one makes it and so forth. So excellent point. That phrase, Lord, Lord, a lot of times when we read about the religious leaders interacting with Jesus, there's a false sense of flattery. In other words, there's sarcasm would be the tone. But what's interesting about this is when Jesus says Lord, Lord, Matthew is essentially communicating that's a term of reverence. So it's not an insincere remark, which makes it frightening. These individuals, like you mentioned, are they believe that they hold Jesus in high esteem. They adore him. They admire him. So you're absolutely right. I put Luke 6 verse 46, why call me Lord, Lord, and that's a term of reverence.
These are not atheists that we're talking
absolutely
about here.
Great point.
It's not people that don't believe he's the Lord. These aren't unbelieving Jews who deny that he's the Messiah and the Lord. These are religiously active people.
Great point. You're absolutely right. And like you said, it sparks attention from okay, well, I admire him, I believe him. Well, what else? What am I possibly lacking? So excellent point. One thing to just point out that I found interesting, the word enter is indicative, which lets us know it's the main verb. The word says and does are in participle form, which lets us know that those are subordinating verbs to the main verb. But what was interesting about this is will enter, is a future tense verb, yet the two participles, says and does, are present. So you have a future tense goal or action with two present tense participles supporting it, essentially implying very heavily that what we do now has the future consequences or reward. And that's, I think, one thing that scares me here, when I say frightening, when it makes it frightening, is when we get to this point, there's no learning and changing or pivoting. There's finality at this particular moment.
I think that is what makes it very, very scary. And you think about this concept of realizing, hey, wait a minute, this is a heaven or hell issue.
Great point.
This really gets right down to the goal of my whole life is whether I hear the words, well done, enter, or depart, as Matthew 25 is going to show. And I didn't write this statement, but I've always loved it because I think it captures so much of what life's all about. It says, where you go hereafter is going to depend on what you go after here. And if I want to go to heaven, then I'm going to have to go after heavenly things here and live for God, live for heaven here, not live with such an earthly mindset, like Paul said, set your affection on things above, not on the earth, there in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and following.
That's a great point. One thing I did mark, I underlined the first person pronouns. It says to me in verse 21, many will say to me, verse 22, I declare, I never knew you, depart from me. And I think that's maybe something, if we're not careful, gets glossed over a little bit, that Jesus in this sermon is establishing himself as the eschatological judge. He's not pointing to the Father as the judge, but he's talking about himself personally, which obviously he did throughout his ministry. He never denied or shied away from the fact that he was deity, and which I think is important here. And in fact, it reminded me of the end of this chapter when they said that he spoke as one having authority, and I think we see it here in this instance as well.
That's an excellent point as it relates to John 5:22. It says the Father's committed all judgment to the Son, and it's the judgment seat of Christ that we're appearing before, according to 2 Corinthians 5:10.
Right.
And yet there's a connection with the Father because he says, he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. But he and the Father are one, according to him in John 10 and verse 30. So to do the will of the Father in heaven is to do the Lord's will. Yeah,
absolutely. That's an excellent point. And like I said, it's not enough to confess. You look at the religious world today, there are millions of people who would confess adoration and Jesus as their Lord. I know it's kind of hard to say that there's sincerity behind it, because are you really sincere if you're not willing to obey? But I do think there are those who believe what they say when they say they admire him, but fall short of that. The confession is empty because the actions don't back it up, and that's the point that he's making in this verse. Verse 22, it says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? What do you have there?
Well, the many stands out immediately because earlier, just a few verses earlier, he's talked about the few versus the many. There, when it comes to the gate that leads to destruction versus the gate that leads to life, He tells us in verse number 13 that the broad way leads to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat, and the narrow way leads to life, and few there be that find it. So the many are revisited here in verse 22, and I find it fascinating. They're saying to him in that day, the day being the day of judgment implied, look at what they're calling him. Lord, Lord. What has he just said in verse 21? Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord. Well, that's
Right.
these people right here. Possibly. I say possibly because you and I call him Lord too. And we might be doing his will, and so it's not wrong to call him Lord. But if we call him Lord, Lord, and do not the things which he says, then our words don't really end up mattering all that much.
Great point. I've underlined on that day and just put the note of judgment. And you alluded to this earlier, which is a pivotal point to this text, is there's a day where you and I have to be successful. Some days, and obviously everyone's been in this situation where I can't do anything right. It's you want to get to bed as quick as you can so the next day comes on. There are days where everything goes right and you can't mess up. But on this day, it has to, the finality of what takes place, we have to be successful. And I'm not saying that to make anyone frightful, because God has given us everything we can possibly need to be successful on that day. He's revealed it to us. He helps us when we walk in the lives He is the light. Then He cares for us, and He wants us to be successful. So I don't want it to be like a pop quiz or a final exam, but it is a day that we have to live to be successful for right now. It's just interesting on that day the way he points it out to his audience, that there is a specific day all of us will face, and we're going to have to we're going to be successful or unsuccessful. And after that, there's no restarting and trying to adjust after again. But the in your name also stood out to me. And that's, are they appealing to him? They did it. They thought they were doing it to his credit. And there has to be something about what they were doing that was not in line with his authority. We know that because Jesus wouldn't have said this if they were acting righteously, whether they were deceiving themselves, like, for example, the Pharaoh's magicians with Moses and Aaron. There was deception there, and perhaps they deceived themselves or whatever. Or perhaps maybe they were doing something along the lines of Philippians 1 and verse 18, when Paul talks about those who preached out of goodwill and those who preached out of selfish ambitions. And he said, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preaching, that'll rejoice. And so there's more to it than just going through the motions that are right. There are some who I believe that that they believe Jesus is the Lord and they admire him, but they're not doing it the way Christ has said. But then on the other hand, there are those who believe he's the Lord and are maybe doing the things that he says, but they're not doing it in the way he intends or for the reasons that are set out. So what else you have?
And is it possible that they're not doing other things he said to do?
Oh, good point.
In addition to the things they are doing that are right. No one would say it's wrong to preach about the Lord or to do many wonderful works in his name. And of course, in that time, there was a need for Jesus to cast out demons to show his superiority over the demonic world. And some might claim that, but that doesn't make it true, like you said, any more than Pharaoh's magicians were actually doing miracles. But I get to thinking about this. I think we always want to hear the question and the answer to who are the only ones going to heaven. We know who's going to heaven according to verse 21. He that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. That person is going to heaven if they do the will of the Father in heaven. But wait a minute, isn't it the will of the Father in heaven to prophesy on his behalf and to do many wonderful works? Yes, but is that the totality of his will? Sometimes use the illustration about the farmer that leaves a will for his boys to follow, and they do two of the three things because they happen to agree with those two things. The one thing they don't agree with in their Father's will, they refuse to do.
Right.
Now, they didn't submit to the will of their Father. They just happened to have the same view in two of the three things he said to do. And the first time their Father's will and their will didn't jibe, they did what they wanted to. And they could say, yeah, we did our Father's will. Look here, we built the fence where he said to build it. We built the barn where he said to build it. And yet, what if he said, I want you to dig the well at this spot? And they said, no, we're not doing that. If I believe in the Bible, only the things with which I agree, it's not really the Bible I'm believing in, it's me.
Excellent point.
It's me, and I don't need to, on the day of judgment, be trying to get into a good relationship with God with partial obedience. That's not enough.
That's an excellent point. And I think you hit the nail on the head. And how many people, and it's something that I guess we hear often, I think this, or I like it when that, and it goes on. It's a great, excellent point that you made as far as the self, and that's essentially what it is. You know, as long as God agrees with me, then I abide by it. But as soon as it doesn't, then what's my choice? Some references I put just with these: cast demon, do mighty work. Matthew 24 and verse 24, 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9. Exodus 7 and 8, that's where Pharaoh's magicians worked. And then there's a magician mentioned in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 2. So just some cross-references there. Verse 23, it says, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. What do you have there?
I think when I read this, what a shock it would have to be for people that thought they knew Jesus to have him look right at them and say, I never knew you. What do you mean you never knew us? We knew you were the Lord, and we told everyone about you and preached about you, and we did many wonderful works. I'm not trying to be unkind when I say this, but people like Mother Teresa and others were exalted for their works and their kindnesses. And we need more people in the world to show kindness and compassion. There's no doubt about that.
Agree.
But I would also point out something here, too. Though obedience is necessary for salvation, because verse 21 says, it's he that doeth the will of my Father that's in heaven, that's going to heaven, that obedience and working is not going to be enough to save me apart from my faith and trust and obedience to the gospel of Christ. And if I think because I've done this many works, wonderful works they are, I've preached this many sermons, you have to know me. No, not if I haven't done what the will of the Father in heaven is in certain areas. Then all the sermons I've preached and all the works I've done are not going to amount to anything. Even after I've done everything I've been commanded to do, I'm still an unprofitable servant, Luke 17:10. But for Jesus to look at a religious group and say, I never knew you, depart from me, would have to be one of the most horrifying things if you really thought that you knew him, only to find out he doesn't recognize you.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. In fact, when you go back up to the word enter in verse 21, it's in the middle person. Middle person just simply means that the subject holds the active and passive role, which very subtly implies truths that have been explicitly stated throughout the New Testament. But there's a passive instant or a passive role the subject has of entering into heaven, in the sense that we have no opportunity to enter into heaven had God not given us that opportunity. So grace and mercy fall into that category. But there's also that active role, which indicates there's at least responsibility on our part as well. And like you mentioned, our works, our merit, aren't going to allow us to get into heaven, but to take the approach that many take today, where they'll argue that if we say we have anything to do with our salvation, our own salvation, then we discount the grace of God, or we discount the sacrifice of Christ because they did everything. That's not what Matthew, and more importantly, that's not what Jesus is teaching here. It's a for lack of a better term, it's a teamwork mentality. There's something I must do, but I understand at the same time I'm afforded the opportunity to do those things because God gave me those opportunities. I need His grace and mercy just as much as I need the obedience that I have on my side. So that's an excellent point. The word declare is a judicial term, and it connotates irreversibility. The finality from this. I declare to you. In other words, I'm reminded of when Moses was trying to plead with God to change his mind so that he might enter into the land of Canaan. You remember what God, speak to me no more of this matter. And that's the same tone of that word declare, that once judgment is rendered, the finality of it is set. What else do you have?
Well, thinking along those lines, the foolish virgins in Matthew 25
Great point. Yeah.
were waiting for the same person the wise virgins were waiting for, the bridegroom, and they thought they would certainly be approved because of their relationship, and yet they didn't do what they needed to do ahead of time to be prepared for his coming. And so when he came, they went to buy their oil, which was an individual thing. Buy for yourselves. We can't get into heaven on someone else's preparation or someone else's obedience. And so they went to buy, and then they came, the door was shut. That's one of the most haunting phrases in the Bible as well. The door was shut. They're knocking, Lord, Lord, open to us. Notice what they're calling him, Lord, Lord, open to us. And he says, I know you not. He opens the door and says, I don't know you. Now, he doesn't mean he'd never recognized who they were. He didn't approve of them in that way. And there's an implication here I meant to mention earlier. We can understand the will of the Father in heaven. Ephesians 5:17 says understanding what the will of the Lord is. And when you read, you may understand Ephesians 3 and 4. And so Matthew 12, 5 chapters later, Jesus Christ is approached by some individuals who say to him, your mother and brothers want to talk to you. He said, who is my mother? Who are my brethren? And then he says, whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven. Sound familiar? Sounds just like what we've been reading here. Whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same person that will do my Father's will, that's the same person that's my brother, my sister, my mother. And so doing the will of the Father in heaven is so absolutely vital.
That's a great point. I'm glad you touched on I never knew you from the standpoint of it's not a unfamiliarity with who they are.
Right.
The word never here stands out to me because essentially what the Lord's saying here is you were never my follower. You were never my brother, sister, or mother. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, doing what we were doing in vain. And one of my favorite songs that I enjoy listening to, my wife hates it, but it's called Only a Fool Believes. And the whole premise of that song is just essentially about a man who thinks that he has this relationship with this particular woman, but in reality, in her mind, there was never that relationship. And it's unfortunate, but there are many who have that type of relationship with Christ. They go where they go on Sunday morning. They do what they believe is right, and they may even do it with the utmost sincerity. But unfortunately, they're not doing it as it's been prescribed for whatever reason. Right. But then, unfortunately, the church isn't immune to it either. There are those who may be going to the right place, doing the right thing around those who are parts of this kingdom, but for whatever reason, and it could be pride, it could be maybe there's a lot of perks to Christianity when you talk about the family likeness, as far as, like you mentioned, those who do the will, brothers and sisters and so forth. There's that sense of being around those of like mind. There's, some people feel good after worship. They go to worship, and when they leave, they're uplifted and encouraged and so forth. All wonderful things about being a Christian, but the pinnacle of Christianity is following in the footsteps of Christ.
Right.
The perks are byproducts of that commitment to the Lord. And you hear it all the time. People talk about the church hurting them, and that's, they leave and I never want to go back there again. Well, that's a relationship with the church. That's not a relationship with Christ. And I think that's a lot, unfortunately, there will be those who find themselves on the day of judgment realizing that their relationship with the church wasn't enough to get them into heaven. It's that relationship with Christ that has to be undying above all.
And their feelings can be so deceiving. I think about John 16, where Jesus says, the time will come when those who kill you apostles, will think they're doing God a service. Saul of Tarsus didn't believe Jesus was the Christ at first, of course, and yet he thought God the Father was proud of him, and that he did everything he did in all good conscience. He was religiously zealous and was doing what he thought he ought to do. I thought I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. If you'd asked Saul of Tarsus prior to the Lord's appearing to him on the road to Damascus, are you doing the will of the Father in heaven? What would he have said? He thought he was.
Absolutely.
He sincerely thought he was, but he was dead wrong. Cornelius, great man, devout, feared God, religious, yet needing to hear words whereby he and all his house might be saved. He has a good attitude. In Acts 10:33, he said, we're here ready to hear all that God has commanded you. And then when he's told what to do, the will of the Father in heaven, he's willing to do it. So the religious man, who is a good moral man, a generous, good man, becomes a saved man. And if those men, Acts 9, Acts 10, back to back, could be sincerely religious and yet religiously wrong, coupled with what we're reading here in Matthew 7:21 and following, it's not enough to be religious. We've got to be in the Lord's religion, following his will, doing the will of the Father in heaven.
That's a great point. This leads me to two points. This whole section and the frightening nature of it leads me to two things. One, I need to make sure that my confession of Christ as the Lord is not empty, which involves obedience, but also involves knowing what I have to do. So continual study, above all, so that if I am missing something, for lack of a better term, then I can rectify it while I have time to rectify it. Because if it gets to this point and I finally learn that I'm doing something wrong, it's too late. The second is that it is possible for sincere people to be wrong, like you mentioned. One of my favorite sayings, and it's probably been said on this podcast before, but we'll say it again. A sincere man can be wrong, but when he is faced with the truth, he either fails to be sincere or he fails to be wrong.
Wow.
And that leads me to the second facet of what this drives us. There are people out there who I believe are sincere and want to avoid this instance on that day, and so our evangelistic efforts, in my opinion, have a greater impact as well when we look at it from this standpoint. I don't want anyone that I know to think that they're doing something right and be disappointed on the day of judgment. You have anything else before we close out?
I believe you've hit the nail on the head, and I'm thankful to be a part of it.
Well, thank you so much, BJ, for coming on. I appreciate it. I always enjoy
sir.
this. To those listening and watching, thank you so much for your support. Until next time, keep studying.
Mark in your Bibles, underline that.